Bonsoir. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this very special evening. I think many of you have not been here yet, so it's a real pleasure to see new faces. The subject of our talk tonight, of course, is one of the most important ones that need to be discussed and that are in the US discussed constantly, but maybe less in France. One of the roles that we as the Terra Foundation here want to play is also to kind of bring to the Parisian public issues that for American art history really are crucial. I don't think I need to say much because the conversation will show how there have been changes in the way one has perceived the legacy of discrimination, the legacy of slavery, of blackness in the US, especially there is even an acceleration, let us say, in the last 5 to 10 years. One thinks not only about kind of retrieving forgotten names or rewriting the canon, it goes much deeper into understanding issues of representational space, identity not as a monolithic block, but something that actually has to do with lived experiences as well. The fact that as a scholar, as an art historian, as an artist, as a critic, one has to not simply point to something, but also try to redeem, to what one calls to transform, maybe by showing what could be instead of what has been, so showing possibilities. So it's an engagement, I think, that is there in scholarship around African American diasporic issues, which is important to think about. Over the years, we've tried in our programming to bring in these issues, and one of the highlights, I think, was when we could work with Danielle Soutif, who is in the room at the moment of the Color Line exhibition at the Quai Branly. So we supported the symposium, we worked on it together. We had Danielle and Rick Powell come and give a dialogue here. We've also, when Lorna Simpson's work was shown at the Jeux de Paume, we invited Lorna to come to our summer academy in Giverny and talk to our students. We've had Kerry James Marshall with us, Thelma Golden, Rick Powell has come several times. So we want to do what we can do from the other side of the ocean in order to make sure that these issues are being discussed. For that, Anne Lafont has been one of our most precious interlocutors. I believe, I forget when was our symposium that we did on African American artists in Paris, and gave a wonderful talk about the boys movement, which was fundamental, I think, for my understanding then. And when she told us that she had as an invited guest Stephen Nelson at in her seminars at the École des hautes études, we said this is the occasion, we need to have him with us. So thank you so much for accepting the invitation. Anne will present Stephen, so I will be very brief, but I would like to take one moment to present Anne Lafont to you. She is really one of the first and the most important voices to think about art and race in France. Her habilitation, l'art et la race, l'Africain tout contre l'œil des Lumières, so art and race, the African all against the eye of the Enlightenment, will be published this year at Presse du Réel and will come out in English with the University of Chicago Press next year. It's a wonderful piece that I hope will change the way the landscape here. She has worked during many years now already on kind of alternative ways of looking also at exploration issues. She has published 1740, un abrégé du monde, savoir et collection autour des alliés d'Argenville. She has a major contribution in there. Plume et pinceau, discours de femmes sur l'art en Europe, 1750-1850. So also very interested in the place of women and gender issues. And then her work, l'artiste savant à la conquête du monde moderne. So exploration at the moment of the late 19th century, when many of our categories were set in place, and most importantly probably the category of race. And then her book on Giraudet, which was the first publication, came out of her. I still think we need to mention it. So she also was editor-in-chief of the Revue Perspective of the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art. Of course, she's now professor at École des hautes études en sciences sociales and was previously at the University of Marne-la-Vallée. Many articles that I can share with you if you want to see the bibliography. But thank you, Anne, for making this possible and for our continuing partnership. So.
Thank you very much. I think we don't need any microphone. Thank you very much, Verle. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to come to the Terra Foundation, and it's the first time that I will participate in a dialogue with a dear colleague and wonderful scholar and guest of École des hautes études en sciences sociales, Professor Stephen Nelson. So I'm very happy to share this time with him. After 1 month, we have been discussing for 1 month through the students, through the seminars, and with colleagues. So it's a kind of feast to have here this conclusive or partly conclusive discussion at the Terra. I will not go back to the wonderful career of Stephen Nelson, Professor Stephen Nelson, who is professor at UCLA, and he's teaching African art and African American art history at UCLA. But I want to point a couple of projects and a couple of topics he has been addressing during this month, and to explain how it comes that I wanted to invite him to share the conversation with the students I have at École des hautes études. But maybe one thing I can say in his huge career is that he will be from September on at the Center for Advanced Studies in Visual Arts in Washington, and he will be for 2 years Mellon Professor at GASBA. And from there, he will be able to develop research and collective work on African American art. And I think for sure we will be following the activities of the CASVAB, because it's a huge program, research program he will be leading with colleagues over there. And before launching the discussion, which will be more something like an interview of Stephen all along, because I think we have to take advantage of his presence in Paris, I would like to get back first to the reasons I invited him as a visiting professor here. And then I will give a quick overlook of the talks he gave before jumping in the proper discussion. It will be the occasion to specify a couple of topics he put to the front, and to question from a French perspective a couple of notions which are just penetrating the French academia but have much longer history in the US, as has said Verle already. The first reason why I wanted to invite Stephen Nelson in France is that he is one of the only scholar, I know, I guess, addressing contemporary African American art while being as well, and even before all, a researcher in African art, and precisely in African architecture from Cameroon. Therefore, he has a double expertise as well as an understanding of the Black Atlantic, based on Paul Gilroy's book, not only from a Western point of view, but from the African one. I am not sure it changes the complete perspective of the Black Atlantic, but Stephen's attention to geography and to African inscription and heritage in the works of contemporary artists might come from his double access to Africa and to its diasporic art. The second reason is that with Caroline Jones from MIT, he managed a unique and exceptional panel at CAA in Chicago the year 2014, I think, on decentering Cold War politics of the arts. And the discussion held at this panel was amazing. As I remember it, it took Cold War outside the major blocks, giving space to Algerian art or Rio's conceptual art, as well as digging in a diversity of arts medias of the global 60s, film, furniture, architecture, and so on. Stephen Nelson and Caroline Jones did address the question of global art history as a fruitful way for renewing art history that was convincingly transformed into a wonderful article I had the chance to publish in Perspective, so the journal of INASHA. I was sure that their way of rewriting art history based on an understanding of globalization that is not only led by the economic market of contemporary art, but on the contrary, conceptualize the notions of encounter and globalization on the longue durée would benefit to the students who specialize in art history as a social science. The third reason why I invited Stephen Nelson, the third reason is that it was a way to give the students all the friends coming now. The third reason I chose Stephen is that it was a way to give the students, even more than the colleagues, I would say, what they really expect. That means analysis from the history of contemporary art field when my research mainly covers the early modern Black Atlantic. But I believe it is necessary to give the students a long history of the aesthetic and the artistic experience at the scale of the diasporic African space. Therefore, I strongly want to invite contemporary art historians to join in my seminars. Stephen is, with Elvan Zabounian, one of the first, but I hope he will be followed by others soon. Very quickly, I want to give a basic idea of Stephen's ongoing work before sharing a discussion with you. Actually, he chose to present 3 chapters of his to-be-published book at Yale University Press entitled Structural Adjustment, Mapping, Geography, and the Visual Cultures of Blackness. And it will be published in a couple of months.
This couple of years.
The first talk was
2020.
2028 now. I'm sure it will be published. The first talk was dedicated to Houston Conwell, and you will see all along the images and the artworks he has been addressing during the talks, and he can go back to the images when we begin the discussion. The first talk was dedicated to Houston Conwell's work and his African commitment, voodoo spirituality, African symbolism, Nigerian sources, and his Africanized spatial design installation. Stephen Nelson did explain and deconstruct the sophisticated making of Conwell's art. The second talk was dedicated to 3 different artists, Bradford, Langa, and Miretu, who deal mainly with the geographic and urban dimensions, real or utopic, in their artistic intervention. And the third talk was fully dedicated to another wonderful artist, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, who happens to be also a friend of Stephen, very well known in Europe also. Stephen got back to the Spoken Softly with Mama installation of 1998, where she, in a very refined and subtle way, evokes the familial history in Cuba, the woman's work and woman's heritage in her family, the Middle Passage, the religious and the rituals. The spatial configuration of the piece is made of mixed medias, creating a multi-layered installation. What was particularly interesting in the talks of Stephen is that he showed us how making art for these artists was something like making history, knitting history, filling in the supposed and or felt emptiness of the diasporic space, or tighten the loose threads of African history seen from the Black Atlantic. The art of Conwell and Campos Pons especially is imbricated in the mapping of the space as an answer to the original and matrix wrench from Africa. It looks like this trauma can be repaired through a recollection of the African remains in the diasporic world and by reconnecting with supposed mythical or even real African ancestry. It is not an archaeological inquiry. It is an imaginary and instrumental reconstruction that artists are making for us, At least it was my interpretation of Stephen's intervention as a whole. And I will begin with, except if you want to say something, or if I got something wrong already and you want to correct.
No, nothing wrong. I love you.
So maybe we can launch the real discussion, which happens to be questions I will address to Stephen. And the first one goes, and he trusted me enough not to read the questions before, and I thank him for that. And I hope it will go well this way. So Stephen, how did you come with the question of the map in contemporary African American art? Was it your choice to delimit this trend in African American art? Or is it a claim of the artist to be understood as geographers, urbanists, territories inventors? And in this specific way, how do they work to question the map, to question the normativity of the map, especially in the colonial times, by using the same tools of the map? That means by using drawing, painting, figuring, representing. It's my first question.
First of all, I want to thank Anne for inviting me to Paris and for being my host for the past 4 weeks. And it has been an amazing journey to be able to bring this work to a new audience and also to experiment in trying to deliver papers in French. But it's been an amazing sort of period with colleagues at HS and at Inisha. And it's been wonderful. So thank you for that, and thank you to the people at Terra for inviting this conversation here. It's really wonderful to be here. I think that the question, your question is wonderful in that it's the basic, the basic question of how do you decide your work, right? And the genesis for this book, and this will be, I think, book number, I'm going to say 3, came as somewhat of a fluke. And so the discussions, these lectures actually started as lectures written for a series that I gave at Harvard University in 2013. And in the summer of 2012, Suzanne Blier, who's an Africanist art historian at Harvard, and Henry Louis Gates Jr., who is the sort of king of literature and fundraising, and this is being recorded, right? And things like that, emailed me and invited me to give these lectures and asked me what I wanted to do, and I was leaving the next day for Germany. And so, I just thought, I have to think about this, And for a while, I had been thinking about the place of maps and geography in the works of a number of artists, who have some African ancestry of one form or another, and so the artists who are in the book, but also artists such as Alan D'Souza, who was born in Kenya and now works in San Francisco, and others, and sort of thinking about why that matters. And so, in essence, I think that there are a large range of artists one could use for that project. The choices I made for Conwill and Bradford and Campus Ponds, Langa and Moretu, came about really by looking at their work. Like, what are they doing in the work? And you'll see, for some of it passing on the slides as you go through. I decided to do a loop because it would just be unwieldy to try to find the right image at the right time. And so, but some of them I had written about Bradford's work before, and it was a piece that became fundamental for this book, and thought about Bradford's relationship to urban space, Los Angeles especially, and segregation, and the way that it lines up. The way that this piece in particular, Los Moscos, which means flies in Spanish, the ways in which space and segregation and formal and informal economies tend to go hand in hand in cities around the world. And so, the other part of your question asks whether these artists thought of themselves as geographers. And I would say that some of them do, if only because we've been telling them that that's what they are for so long. I mean, absolutely Bradford. There's no two ways around that. Moretu, absolutely. And so with her, I mean, she's interesting in that regard, where she knows that in a way she's dealing with what we would call data, right, or information graphics, or in her work. And my contention was always that she got it from her father. And which is a weird thing to say, especially for someone like me who doesn't always believe in biography as a way into thinking about art making. But in interviews, Moretu would always talk about her father, and I just thought that it was the weirdest thing. And so I asked myself, well, what does her father do for a living? And so I Googled her dad, and it turns out that he's an economic geographer who was trained in Ethiopia, and the family moved from Ethiopia to Michigan in 1973. So Moretu was about 3 years old. And he went to teach at Michigan State. And so, but he wrote books, published these books on economic geography and what it has to do with the Horn of Africa and these other places and inequality and these kinds of things. And so I started reading his books. And the books, I mean, the information went in one, came in the eyes and went out the ears. But he makes these charts in these books that are unreadable. That, for me, and I, in full disclosure, used to make informational graphics for a living. But pre-academia, I used to make maps, which is another reason for the book, yes. But that's neither here nor there. But she talks about her own work as characters, like, from meteorological maps, weather maps, and these things. And she said something about their having left her work in, around the year 2000. And my contention was that they never left, was that they just sort of took different forms. And so and in her work, what one can see is a kind of mapping of spectacle, a kind of, sort of recreation of an event in a form that promises to offer information, but in the end doesn't. And I think that, to make a long answer longer, I think that what is so powerful about the map, and I think this is true for everyone who encounters a map, that when you see a map, you look for yourself in it. That, if it is a map of the world, I'm looking, the first thing, and it is unconscious, the first thing I want to look for is, where am I in this map? Where my hometown, where I live now, where I'm going on vacation, where, we start to construct ourselves on the surface, we project ourselves onto the surface of the map, right? And in a colonial map, you can imagine, right? What is that relationship that is being set up, right, with the map, which carries with it some amount of authority, right? And how it constructs subjects based on its ability to convey authority. And so I wanted to think about how that is, or ask, really, whether that's undone by these artists in their work.
And as you have seen in the PowerPoint, there is one painting by Jasper Jones, and so I was wondering, is it something specific to African American artists to deal with the map, or?
I think, I so desperately want to say yes to you. Because I had this, there's always these moments where you think you're onto some amazingly big idea that's a book, and then it's maybe a conference paper and no more than that. And that happened to me with maps and African American artists, and it was during this project. And so, in setting up this project, I started looking at earlier work, right, where African American and Afro-Atlantic artists have been using maps. And there are a couple of those works in this presentation. And I thought I would just be overwhelmed by the amount of work. And it's just not the case. And so there's Faith Ringgold, who made these amazing maps in the late 60s and early 1970s that explored the American industrial, military prison complex. There are maps of sort of Africa as motherland in a sort of new diasporic consciousness in the 1960s. And then there's Frank Bowling's work. He did a number of map paintings between 1967 and 1971. One of them is up here. And there was a show of these works at the Whitney in 1971. And so I thought, okay, then this must be like what Huey Copeland and Krista Thompson have called an Afro-trope, like these sort of very basic aspects of things that are almost just sort of indexical to African diasporic cultures. And so it's like, oh, the map of Africa, absolutely, it is there, absolutely. And so I do my CAA conference paper and do my 20 minutes, and I am there, and I'm good. And Huey and Krista are like, well, now you have to write the article. And I was like, oh. And so I'm writing this article, I'm like trying to amass stuff, and the stuff just isn't there. It's just, and I had to write to them sheepishly and say, I think it's interesting, but probably not an Afro-trope. Failure of the trope. And so, however, it's still interesting. And because now, alongside of fine art, or whatever you want to say, in popular culture, the map is everywhere. The map is, a map of Africa as the sort of symbol of African Americanness is everywhere, and it has been since that time. So,
thank you. So I will go to the second question, which is related to the first one, because you put to the front a new critical art history embedded in the questions related to race and space. So it's what we have seen with the map, local and global. And that is the way I understood it, at least, and in my opinion, the way you work is so singular. Therefore, I am wondering what, from your perspective, are the challenges of such a new domain in art history? How is it reshaping the object of art history, beginning with the obviously privileged medium installations, architecture, and utopic urbanism or design, and how it's what I understood from your talks, how race and space, not only the map or the mapping of the, but how it goes through new medias like installation, and how it's addressing in a way the question of race and space, and how maybe it's the question of the maps, I don't know if I am wrong, but maybe the questions of the maps is, in my mind, more related to the questions of colonialism even in a new way, but race and space is something maybe more specific to the US or to the Western world, maybe. I'm not sure. I'm just wondering if it's something, and I'm more thinking to Bradford, for example.
Yes. Bradford or Moretu, or even in a, and yes, to your question, I think that I think that space is raced, right? Space is raced. And I think that it would be hard, or at least as, an African-American child in the 60s who grew up around Boston during the whole desegregation stuff, that there was no way you could divorce your subjecthood as black going into a city that was not friendly, to say the least. But in terms of be it in the space of a painting, or in dealing with urban spaces, or dealing with even art spaces, the museum, the gallery, all of those things. And what I've tried to do as a scholar, and there's a lot of important work out there that does this, and some of it's been written by people in this room, that what happens, the real challenge, I think, is to think about spaces as not neutral. And so, in terms of 19th century scholarship, we have, people who have really done a lot of work and successfully showing us how spaces are gendered, right? that, the space of painting, even the ability to become a painter, and all of those things, all of these things are gendered. And so that kind of work was actually extraordinarily important for me, coming up as a graduate student who had started actually as a modernist interested in the 19th century. I wasn't always an Africanist. And so to see that kind of work, and this is going back to the early 1990s, and to then start thinking about how race works differently, and thinking about work about colonization, thinking about Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, that kind of work, and then actually looking at artwork itself, right? Made me sort of at least try to think about how, not just the artists here, but artists generally, in the Afro-Atlantic and on the continent, start dealing with this sort of meeting place of a race subject, right? And spatial engagements. And for some it's colonial. I mean, I think even in this example, Meshach Walanga was born in South Africa under apartheid, and his map pieces start thinking about, sort of the placement of people in spaces on a piece of paper where in reality they don't actually live in the space bounded by this thing. And that's true of maps of Africa. The sort of one of my favorite examples is this old 1959 cultural map of Africa that was produced by a guy named George Murdoch. That, as graduate students, Dominique is smiling because she had to do this too. We were all basically made to learn this map, right, by our advisor. We had the same advisor. And then at a certain point we realized, well, wait a minute, this piece is called X, but X lives here and X lives there and they live over there too. That the map wasn't fitting, right? And artists have taken this up. Right? But I think in terms of spaces, like the museum, right? Thinking about these meeting places, right, for Black artists, for African artists, has been a way to undo the fiction that a museum is neutral space, right? Or that, the city is neutral, right? And so, and those are the kinds of things that are important for me in terms of teasing out what's important about the work that I'm looking at.
And it makes me think also of one artist that was invited also by the Terra Foundation, I think in November or October, from Chicago, who has been...
The Esther Gates.
Yes,
yeah.
the Esther Gates,
absolutely.
which are absolutely in this trend to rework also the urban space.
Yes,
yes. Okay.
And beyond the artists you have been working on in your book, and there are several stars in the African American art world that has come across the Atlantic to France, like Kara Walker. And she is one of them, of course. And even before the wonderful exhibition of Daniel Soutif last year, Colorline, Walker had 11 years ago in France a monographic exhibition at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. We all heard about strong debates between the artists like Kara Walker and Betty Saar or Howardina Pindell, for example. Would you be so nice to sum up in a couple of words what was at stake in these disputes, in a way? Because I didn't want to address this kind of marginal and anecdotic histories, but I was asked to last week, and I said I preferred to address what they are doing than why they are arguing. But along the way, I started to think that the disputes, the theoretical, aesthetic, and ideological conflicts between artists make the line and even serve as guiding threads in the historiography of art, because it gives space to complexity and diversity of African American art, which is fortunately a contradictory, full of passion and of controversies field. So a situation we do envy from France. As I said, would you share with us the main arguments of these disputes between African American artists?
Well, I think that the Kara Walker disputes, which took place over almost a decade, really, that off and on, really, I mean, when it comes down to it, I mean, to give the sort of thick history, which we don't really have time for, some of the same things were said about Betty Saar and Howardina Pindell back in the 1970s and 1980s that they then in turn said about Kara Walker later. So much, I think a lot of the anxiety around that controversy was the fear that the ways in which Kara Walker represented figures played into the hands of racists, and played into the hands of a presumably white art world that wanted to see denigrating images of blacks. And the same thing was said about Aunt Jemima, which is on the screen, that was made in 1972. The same was said about some of Pindell's work from the early 80s. But what it points out, I mean, if I, my own piece, my own, sort of allegiances, if for lack of a better term, and I think that's a pretty bad term to use, in all of that was to really, if I had to side, I sided with Walker. And to think about what her work does. I mean, we kept sort of limiting this conversation to is it a good representation, is it a positive representation, or a negative one? And that was the level of that debate, and it cut out any possibility for anything else to be said about this work. But what it calls up, and I think what you point to rightly, Anne, is that there isn't a monolithic way that African American artists and African American audiences sort of think about the things that are represented, and there's no monolithic way that it hits us, right? Although the perception, there are moments of strategic essentialism that we will all tell you that we think one thing, and then amongst ourselves we will not. We'll say something else, and there's Walker now, by the way. But I think what the debate did point out, and actually Darby English wrote about this in his first book in 2007, that there is this notion that representation has ripple effects in the real world, right? And that within circles, within African American circles, there is a fear of the ways in which artwork and representation gets used by a larger white public. So that they're, this is the artist that all the white people like because she denigrates us, or this is the artist, you see it with academics. So, all the academics like that black author because he speaks our language. Right, and you see similar things in fears and actual things that happen in the art world.
And does she feel trapped in a way, or
Kara? No.
Okay.
No. what Kara says, or
I'm tired. I read.
Tired. Well, she's tired, but we're all tired. But what she back in the day, what she said, what she would say is, well, because her father was an artist. Or is an artist. Her father's still alive, and her father is the African American artist, Larry Walker, and she said, oh, well, my father made really nice work and really socially responsible work, and I just don't do that. and she said, my work, and she's actually she's very quiet, and very and very nice. And she's sort of the embodiment of her father's work until she opens her mouth, right? And then she's like, well, my work is supposed to pierce and stab and cut and do these things. So she sees her own work as closer to, say, a Robert Colescott, who makes these sort of very sort of questionable remakes of paradigmatic Western works. There's one in the pile here. And just sort of really sort of pushing the boundaries, in terms of what's acceptable and what is not. And that's what Walker is doing. She's pushing, sort of putting her finger in the mud of American race relations between men and women, and the slavery and its, and its continued trauma. And she puts her finger in it and just sort of wishes it around, and you're like, ow, And intentionally, you're supposed to re-feel. In a way, you're supposed to re-experience that trauma, and the fear in the battle of representation, as it was that it would fall into the wrong hands, right? So.
But what can an artist do with the reception sometimes of the work?
I mean, yeah, but it spurned the whole thing. There was a whole industry of bad papers by graduate students, by scholars, by curators on Kara Walker's work, and she would collect it. People would send, if I can gossip, we would all send her bad papers about her work, and she would collect them. She collected them for years.
But what is also interesting is that we have many disputes in the art history dealing with the question of what can we show, what we cannot show, and so it's. Even if the discourses are saying it's about ideological reception of the work of art, it's also of what is art, what can art show, and what art cannot show and cannot give to the audience. So
absolutely, absolutely, and it's always a question too about how is art perceived in the public domain, right? We can sit here and say one thing, and then you can put the thing on a wall in a museum, and you do not know. You just don't know. And Walker is a really good case in point. The first time I encountered her work was in a catalog I edited when I was still a graduate student in 1996. And it was a show at the ICA Boston. And Walker was in it with a number of other artists from all over the place. And I led a tour of the show when it was up to a group of 50 black women. And they were a business group based in Boston, and they're the youngest are in their 20s and the oldest are in their 70s, and we're all in the ICA Boston, and we get to Kara Walker's work. And one woman piped up and said, "This is why I don't come here. Work like this is why I don't come to this museum." and you cannot control that situation, and so it just went. And the younger women and the older women were like, "We think that this is great. We think this is fine." But there were women right around who would be now 60, all right, who were just like, "No, This is imagery that just basically feels like it don't belong here, and this is why I don't come here." And so I could not have gauged that, or even how that would play out in terms of age, or how it would play out in terms of other kinds of.
You think the generation is something?
I think it's a big thing. Okay. I think it's a big thing.
Okay, yeah. So I go on. And you came up with the concept of blackness, which is very difficult to translate in French. I tried to find my way to use two words, africanité and négritude, because I think it is a mix of these two notions. And the first one dealing with history, affiliation with, in a way, Mother Africa, of all people of color around the earth, direct or indirect affiliation. And the second notion, négritude, was conceptualized by French intellectuals from the French colonial Caribbean, like Aimé Césaire and Sénégalese Léopold Sédar Senghor in the 30s, to point the creation and inventiveness of black, racially speaking, this time, intellectuals in the contemporary world. Defining themselves into the modernity of the West, they downplayed a little bit, I think, the legacy and the history of Africa in their identity. Africanité is the historical part of blackness, and négritude, in my opinion, is the horizontal one, the anthropological and racial one, which at the same time might be more ambiguous. But you came up with a translation for blackness, noirité. Would you explain us what is blackness in your mind and in English, and why you needed to invent a word for it in French?
Because my French is bad. No,
I don't think so.
It is, but
because it works. But
it works. It was one of the first. This question that Anne is asking is one of the first issues we encountered during my first talk at Inisha, when before I started, Anne said, "Well, blackness. We're what? We don't know." and so we started talking, and I was talking with a friend. I don't think I told you this. I was talking, it was the first night I was in Paris. I was horribly jet lagged, and translating my talk, and I was on social media, which is not unusual, and so I'm private messaging with a friend of mine who was in Spain, and I said, well, blackness, I don't know what to call it because it's not negritude and it's not Africanity. What if I say noirite? Because that seems like, and I was thinking about it in terms of other ways that you would describe ethnicity or something like that in a French context. And I was like, well, the closest I can think of is noirite, which then encompasses a whole range of different things. Because if I were going to say blackness is X, it would be inaccurate, because I think blackness is something that is a sort of a state of being or feeling black, right? That doesn't align with ethnicity. It's not African American or Afro-Atlantic or African, but it is a sort of thing that includes some of what we would call negritude or Pan-Africanism. But it's not confined by that either. And so it is this notion of a kind of state of being or a thing an abstract thing that somehow gets articulated, right, through the way that I live or through the artwork that I make or the writing that we do. And to encapsulate that, I thought that noirite was the most thoughtful sort of manner in which to try to capture it, because it's a kind of essence. I know it's sounding really abstract, but it's like this is going to be an even worse analogy. But I've been sort of flashing back to like early grad school and thinking of like, jouissance. How do you translate that? And it was like, thank you, Jan. And it was this whole thing, and that it was untranslatable, but we could kind of get what it might mean, the idea. And that's sort of how that happened.
But it works very well, Marite. I hope it will come through the minds here and over there, and it will work. Because it's true that Pan-Africanism is something that's much more political, maybe. Noirite belongs to a kind of essence, but also a kind of feeling and a belonging to something. Maybe we should stop. Is that it?
No, please. We have at least 20 minutes.
Okay.
Maybe I have a last question.
Okay, because I want to make sure we open up to the audience as well.
Should I ask my last question? Sure. Okay. So I would like to ask you how France functions in the contemporary African-American artist world. We know that it has been thought of as a place of liberty without segregation during the 20th century, from Tanner and Josephine Baker to James Baldwin, at least. Is it still true in their fantasy? Because it's a fantasy, but is it still working in their fantasy or not at all? And I would add, how can you explain how we in France need American scholarship to impose new art historical domains? It was true for a long time regarding visual cultures, gender studies. It is still the case regarding art and race, or the existence of a black art as a serious domain of investigation for art history and art criticism. How can you explain that exemplarity and that token of the US scholarship in the French?
I think that if the first part of your question is that I think that France still holds a place of mythic status and even of romance for a certain number of black artists, sure, of course, and for me, and and for others, and the difference is that back in the 1920s. When artists were coming over here, or even with Tanner, that there were clearly available opportunities for black artists in Paris that did not exist in most of the United States, that they could do things here that they could not do there. And so that difference is less pronounced, is less of a need, right? But there is still the very, very concrete notion that travel allows you to do things that you cannot do, right? Or that, for those of us, artists, scholars, whatnot, who work globally or diasporically, that if you want to sort of really come to a meeting place, a very deep meeting place of diasporic activity, it's Paris. It is Paris. For me, Paris is an African city.
It's what you said.
It's an African city.
There
is nothing in the United States like this.
Okay.
Nothing. And especially for me, I live on the west coast of the United States. It is not African. It's not. We have a great African collection on my own campus, but in terms of the energy and the kinds of presences one sees, LA is not African, San Francisco is not African. New York, Philadelphia, Washington, a bit more so. But you go to Paris, or you go to London, or you go to Madrid, and it's a really different world. And so that, in and of itself, is a real draw. But also, I think that, it's funny because it's, one can say that, okay, France needs to look at the scholarship in the United States to sort of push its boundaries and to do A, B, C, or D. Having been here for 4 weeks, I actually think that it goes both ways. Oh, absolutely. Some of the conversations I've had, some of the people I have met, and the kinds of projects that people right here in your own backyard are doing, would be amazingly radical in the United States. The kinds of things, the kinds of conversations you're having between people from Africa, people from Europe, and people from the States, they don't happen as often over there as they do here. And part of it's just, it's proximity, it's geographic proximity. You're closer, and you're a great meeting spot for you're halfway between Dakar and New York, so you have Paris as a kind of entrepot. Or some of the books that I've been reading since I've been here that I don't necessarily have at home. That the ways in which one thinks through kind of African agency, or at least Francophone African agency, and how it's playing out in France, is a really interesting way to sort of augment the ways that those of us in the States are thinking about such issues. And so I think, for me, the real coup would be to have more meetings where people are breaking out of their sort of nationally defined conversations, right? And so, because even if you go over to London, that's a different conversation too, right? Or to Switzerland, or to Italy. And so what we find is that things are so bounded. We think of all of these places in Europe and Africa as being bounded, and in Asia as being bounded, but somehow the American context is not being, and it's just not true. We're bigger. And so we've got a bunch of little bounded conversations just in the US. And so, but I think that, sure, there's American scholarship that can, sort of push the kinds of real work that you and Dominique and some of your colleagues are doing, absolutely. But I think that the kinds of things you are doing and the kinds of very deep shifts in the field that you're starting to push, and the results you're starting to see are in part happening, so a lot of it's homegrown, and you don't need American scholarship to do what you're already doing. I think that the conversations are really valuable both ways.
Both ways. Very optimistic conclusion. Thank you, Stephen. We can open up.
And so, would anyone in the audience like to ask any questions. If that's a no, I'm perfectly happy to talk with my friend Anne.
And he understands perfectly French. So you can ask in French and he will understand the language he's choosing. So please don't be shy.
Or if not, Anne can translate it.
We'll help one another. Anyway.
Yes, thank you for your talk. Would you mind to go back to the concept of blackness and negritude?
Sure. What about them? How they're different, or how they're... Well, I think that negritude, I think, captures a kind of modernist essence, right, of blackness that even back in the 1950s and 1960s, people had a lot of problems with. That it sort of pits a kind of essential earthy blackness against a white rationality that a lot of people have had issues with. Whereas I think the kind of paradigm that I would like to sketch out for blackness is not that. It's not this sort of essential l'âme africaine. Or l'âme noire. It's sort of not related to that sort of debate, of Senghor and Sartre and all of that. It's not that. I'm gonna like walk into a trap. It's not that apolitical, I guess, is something I would say about it, right? And those were the arguments and the criticisms that even, Anglophone Africans had with negritude in the 1960s, that it was too apolitical, that it didn't change structural racism. Right, it didn't. It was to carve out a place for black people at the great table of civilization, but it didn't change the structure of how we thought about civilization. And I think that that's part of how I understand negritude. All right, I think blackness. I'm not sure that blackness does that either. All right, but I think that what one sees, or how I would understand blackness, is something that is inflected by experience and by cultural experience and political experience, right? At least in the United States, right? That histories of race relations in the United States are a frame through which we can understand blackness as a whole bunch of things, right? It can be differentiated by age, geography. Income, all of these things. I think the poet Gary Young defines blackness rather beautifully, and he basically defines it by not being able to define it. And it's, or what he says is, there's this kind of beautiful analogy. He says it's the blues on Saturday night and church on Sunday morning. Or, it's Saturday night, and Sunday morning, we've buttoned up. That it is this notion that is slippery, that encompasses states of being and paradox and contradiction. And I don't know if that's, I'm not being very clear, I know, but it's,
Maybe I just would add, from my understanding from Stephen's work, is also that the noirité is more like a constructed category, something, and negritude more something with its biological bias in a way.
Absolutely.
And I think in this sense it's really interesting to work with this idea, and it's surprisingly we don't have something equivalent in French. So, well, now we have. He gave us to us, but we didn't have that, and I think it's really interesting.
It's not an essence. I think it's something constructed.
Constructed category. Yeah. So you can fill it in with ideas you need to construct blackness, and it's, I think. Oh, Daniel.
Jan has the mic.
I got the microphone because I think I had my hand up first. Thanks. I think I got the microphone.
You have the
Yes,
mic, yeah.
of course. I didn't see you, Jane. Sorry.
It's okay. I just wanted to say that I completely agree with the framing that Stephen is making of Muarte, because as soon as you said, without realizing how Stephen had translated it, the two possibilities, I was like, no. And I completely agree that the defamiliarization of Muarte forces a reflection on what that experience, political, cultural, aesthetic, can be in really important ways. One other thing with regard to that, and then I actually do have a question, I'm sorry, to weigh in doubly. There's also a problem when one is writing about France, about writing about Frenchness. When I wrote a piece about Olympia entering the French National Collections, now about 15 years ago, that I gave at the Louvre and then translated for an exhibition volume, there was this crisis because you couldn't use the word francité because that had been appropriated by Vichy. And one is left with this kind of gaping hole where there might be a word that would let you talk about even how people assimilate the Frenchness of things. So just to put that into the mixer.
Yeah. Well, that was the frame I was thinking of, actually, when I was trying to come up with a word. Yeah.
You want to keep a big distance on that, of course, but it's also just really significant to use that defamiliarization, and I think that works much better than say noirceur, which would immediately leave you with all kinds of other problems in addition to it. So here's my question. You said earlier that at the point where you realized that you didn't have maps everywhere in these contemporary artists, but you suggested, and I know that you've been talking about this within your seminars in the past 3 weeks that I would have loved to have attended, but I was busy striking in London and not striking in London, which goes on in the craziest of ways, ugh. In the moment of realizing that there isn't a map in as many artists as you expected, you said that there were other ways that maps appeared, and then you said, but maps are everywhere in popular culture. I was wondering if you could talk about those two things. First of all, how maps appear without necessarily being maps as such, whether it's in contemporary art or even in the ways that we talk about things or place them in museum structures, but also what do you mean by it's everywhere in popular culture?
Well, I'll take this, thanks Jan. I'll take the second part first. Everywhere in popular culture, if you go into like a knick-knack store, I mean it really literally, like tchotchkes and shirts and jewelry and earrings and baubles, they will have maps of Africa on them. Like everywhere, right? And so when the map appears everywhere in popular culture, I mean it very literally, like on cloth, I have my Africa t-shirt, I have my Africa hat, I have my kente cloth with Africa printed on it. It's everywhere, right? With the first part of, what did I just do? Did I just break it? With the first part, I actually think that what some artists have been doing, and actually Compass Ponds is a really good example, where, what they may be thinking about, what I think they are thinking about, not all of them, but many of them, as opposed to using a map or representing a map, right? They're mapping. And so, instead, and they might not even literally be thinking about, information graphics, but they're mapping spaces, right? They're mapping emotions, they're mapping, and I'm thinking in that sense of the kind of literature, Frederick Jameson, cognitive mapping, which he wrote, 30 years ago. And those kinds of actions where, mapping becomes a kind of metaphor for laying out, right? For for elaborating on different issues or states of being.
Thanks.
Yeah. And so Holly had a hand up, Danielle had a hand up.
My question was again about blackness. Do you think that double consciousness is an essential part of blackness?
Yeah. Yes.
And that may be the main difference between blackness and negritude, because I guess that in negritude there is no double consciousness.
No, yeah, no. Thank you for that question, Danielle. I think that that's actually, I hadn't thought about it explicitly, but I think that that's right. I think that double consciousness, W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, which he sort of, published in 1903, basically says, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, that that Black Americans see their own culture and they see the dominant culture around them as well, and that they are, this sort of notion of double consciousness means they're fully consciousness of both. I think that's absolutely part of this. That there is no way of experiencing blackness or being black, right? At least in the United States, I would say the same must be true here. Where you are not also aware of the larger culture around you and the way that that impacts on you and the way that that sort of affects your day-to-day being. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that I thank you for that, because I actually think that that starts to get to really fundamentally how this is different, right? Because even Pan-Africanism doesn't talk about that. Exactly, as an experience. Negritude is, exactly, negritude is your sens, right? Sens, your esprit, your id, in a way, your identity, right? It is, you are born with it. What's that?
Maybe if you're a guy.
Yeah, if you're a guy, right?
I mean, I'm not sure if negritude.
Yeah, but that's how it's formulated, right? It is your inner essence, and blackness is not. Yeah, it's something that is constructed. I think.
And maybe you cannot escape negritude. You can escape blackness in a way if you want to. It's something you no.
That's all another. That's the conference, right? No, I mean, because obviously, for the first place one would go is post-black, and post-black only shows you how important black is. I mean,
it's
and
true.
so.
Well, Dominique, and after that, if you want to, Dominique first.
I was just curious when you speak. No, it's fine without it.
They're recording, so.
When you speak about blackness being something that is rather abstract and not defined by your looks, for example, I was curious about the individual choices in defining yourself. If you could say something about the level of freedom one has in defining oneself and belonging to that idea. We already touched a little bit upon it right now with the last question.
I think that's a really good question, and I think that one's freedom in terms of defining oneself with respect to blackness or actually whateverness, right? At least in the United States, is largely defined on your economic status, your race, your gender, where you live, and perhaps your level of education, right? And so there are a lot of different intersections that would take place. And so for me, given my level of education, given that I live in the second biggest city in the United States, given that I'm at a very liberal university, I have a lot of latitude, to define myself, to define my blackness, to define my sexuality, to do whatever, right? The same would not be true for someone who lives 5 miles away in an impoverished part of the city who has no opportunities and has no chances. Because I would love to be able to say I can define myself and no one else has any say in that, but I am also a subject in the United States of America in 2018, right? Which is a very different experience from being a subject in the United States in 2016. Right? And so, so that you've got a part to do, right? Between what I can, these strictures of how I can define myself which will change depending on the context. It's different for me sitting in a classroom than it is with my friends, than it is in my home, than it is in my parents' house, right? But that the outside world also has some effect, right, on how one defines oneself.
Just to add, otherwise we wouldn't even need to define ourselves, perhaps, if it wasn't for the others. So I guess it's hard to escape.
It's a weird combo of want and need, right? I don't need to define a lot of myself, but I do anyway, right? And so.
I think we can take one short question.
I thought Dominique had a question.
Oh, sorry.
Two short questions.
All right, it'll be short. I was just, you mentioned social media and you mentioned also travel. I'm thinking of cultural travel. And
Yes.
I'm thinking of, you've got TV shows like Empire, in which the background is Kehinde Wiley, where
Yeah.
you have another show, Blackish, and you have
Yes.
the Noah Davis's work.
Yes, yes.
So actually, this may be for both of you. I'm just wondering, with social media today, are we getting a different sense of African diaspora in terms of the travel of art, so that we may see African American art here in France as we didn't previously, or see the cycle of African art as well?
Do you want to answer?
Black Panther.
I think yes. I mean, also one has to, Black Panther, right? I mean, a Black Panther for me personally could not have come at a better time because I am starting a 270-person class in African art on Tuesday. And so, I actually think that social media has made art a lot more visible. Television, though, I mean, Blackish and Empire are not the first shows to feature black art. And so Good Times in the 1970s, Eddie
Cosby
Barnes,
Show.
The Cosby Show.
Which was really famous in France too.
It was famous in France and it was always on work, but that's neither here nor there. I'm gossiping again, I'm sorry. But it was his own collection. But TV has actually been fairly good about representing African American art. But what you point to with social media, I think it does mark a difference, because it's not just people taking pictures of everything they see. So I'm running around Paris and I see I go into the museum. I went into Centre Pompidou and there's a show of Lyle Ashton Harris's work there, and an African American artist, and and I have Instagram, and so I'm just like. And so people are seeing it, right? And people do this, right, on their social media webs, on their feeds. And so even if it doesn't mean that more of that work is showing up in Paris necessarily, or in France, more people are seeing it. And I think that that's kind of it's a really interesting phenomenon. And museums are doing it too. And so museums are posting pictures and their collections and stories and all of that. And I actually think that it's really, it's really fascinating. Did you?
No, I didn't have anything to add, or maybe we can go on with the discussion after that. Dominique, do you have a quick question, please?
I'm afraid I want to come back to the Noirité question.
Drop a stink bomb at everyone.
A few years back, maybe a year and a half ago, Politique Africaine, the journal, published an issue on blackness. The title was Blackness.
In French?
In French.
In French, but it was blackness.
Blackness.
Okay.
And the reason I bring this up is because I'd like to think about what contexts this neologism of yours can actually do work in.
Yeah.
So for instance, it makes a great deal of sense, and I agree with Anne, in the context of France. But of course, as we all know, French is not only a language of France.
Exactly.
And so there is the question of what kind of work can it do, should it do, could it do in a Francophone African context? My question to you.
Oh, you're asking me? Or but I suspect that you could answer this better than I could. I mean, to be perfectly blunt. That's a really interesting question. Because even within Francophone Africa, I've worked in Senegal and Cameroon, and those are two radically different contexts socially, in terms of their relationship to the larger black world, in terms of their relationship to Paris. Douala and Dakar are just, they're far more different than, New York and Chicago, or New York and LA. I think that the ways, I'm not sure it can do work there. I wonder if blackness, actually untranslated, does a kind of work that perhaps a term like noirité cannot. Right? But it's something, I had not even thought about that, to be honest with you. It's a really, really fascinating question.
Dinner talk.
I think with this we can end. It's a wonderful question to take with us. You're all invited for a glass of wine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.